and welcome to The Brood. This episode, we're going to talk about John Carpenter. It's our first episode dedicated to a director, so that's going to be interesting. I'm here tonight with Josh. Say hello, Josh.
Hello.
And Chris.
Hi there.
So I thought that a good way to start would be to maybe talk briefly about Halloween, since it is Halloween. And also because I think this is Carpenter's first horror film, I think. I think I'm right about that. And it might be a good way to sort of set up maybe some technical issues that run along his career, maybe even ideological or anything that might set us up for the other films we're going to discuss. And just to mention that briefly, we're going to talk about The Thing, They Live, and Prince of Darkness. First off, maybe I'll just throw it out to you guys. Does anything about Halloween seem to kind of establish John Carpenter as a horror director? And if so, what aspects of that film seem important?
I think that it sets up right away from the very beginning this idea that we discussed a lot kind of in our conversation before the podcast about perspective in John Carpenter or perspective, point of view, the point from which we see things in his films and what information is there and kind of what the implication of that way of seeing is. And I think you get a couple different varieties of that in Halloween. From, early on we talked about, seeing from behind a mask in John Carpenter, a very clear POV shot. It's a pretty strong statement early on in the film. And then these other kind of shots of, long shots of people from a distance and, how much you can really gather from those shots, the amount of information, how much he uses that in his favor to create more dread, more horror. I think that's a technique that we see used early on very strongly in Halloween. It's, I think, one of the most significant things about the film.
Yeah, and I think the kind of coldness that comes with that is right there that we're going to see, that kind of distance and that almost clinical kind of observation. Yeah, it's definitely right there from the beginning. And also his kind of what I would call one of his kind of signature tricks through most of his movies, which is that just kind of embodying some abstract concept, setting it to work through the film, like let's have our embodiment of evil or fate or whatever Michael Myers is, and let's throw him into this little town and see what happens.
Yeah, and I think you pointed out that he's referred to as the Shape in the film. Is that in the first one? He's in the credits. It's the Shape. Yeah, I was thinking about that. Yeah, the Thing, the Shape. These very, very general, non-specific like ways of referring to these things. I think early on, it's a really, I think he's trying to get a very pure kind of essence of horror and dread and these embodiments. And I think that we see that in Halloween, The Thing, and Prince of Darkness is really pure horror, kind of unrelenting, and what happens when a horror and what a very problematic thing, evil, takes a form. And I think you had brought that up, Josh. Like I find it very problematic in Halloween, this idea of evil, as a concept of this pure evil that Michael Myers is. But I think that that's something that John Carpenter is, throughout a couple films is playing with, and it pops up right away in Halloween.
Yeah, that was the big thing for me in rewatching it, is we have the subjective camera, but it's the subjective point of view, through the eyes of the mask, but it doesn't give any content. It doesn't give any reasons. It doesn't give you subjectivity in the way that we think of that term in everyday conversation. Like, this is my subjective point of view. That you don't get any reason behind why things happen. There's no explaining of Michael Myers. The point of view doesn't really tell us anything, because this is a completely foreign, evil person I think, who is not given much of a humanity, or any humanity, I don't think. I don't know. I mean, that's something I'm struggling with because of I feel like there's something about that is supposed to get us into the body or the space, or at least the visual field of the person. But it doesn't give anything beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's weird because I tend to think of that kind of, it's been used a lot. Argento's used that as well.
Mm-hmm.
That killer point of view. And it really isn't a first person point of view. It really is a second person point of view. It takes the viewer and it's like all of a sudden you're in the film. Those are my hands, moving in the frame or something. And so it does feel like almost like a blank space in the movie that you're supposed to come and fill something in, which is the way I feel about a lot of this. That there's, I don't know, Carpenter walks a line there, I think, between this kind of distance and, which I kind of appreciate, the not overtelling, and then there's not a lot of, there's certainly not deep psychology happening anywhere in here. And then sometimes feeling like I'm too far away, that there's not enough. Characters are hard to root for in Carpenter, I think. Yeah,
that's fantastic. But also, I was thinking as I was watching, I think Michael Myers is a horror director. He's directing these scenes. He creates these beautiful like tableaus of death. The scene where the girl is killed and there's a Halloween pumpkin next to her, and I can't remember, the boyfriend who's stabbed and pinned to the cabinet, and Michael just kind of cocks his head to look at it as though he's looking at a painting he's just created. Like, he's a director. He's making these scenes, and
the gravestone above the head.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of referring. It's self-reflexive in a way, because Halloween is probably, I think, one of the most beautiful horror films, and it's a film that's very much trying to capture this something very like poetic and beautiful and kind of lasting and beautiful about this time of year, this sentiment, these kind of fears, this dread, these lonely streets. I mean, I was watching it again. I think it's so gorgeous, and to see, like you said, these tableaus of death. I mean, I feel like you could just also just be taking one step further out and talking about Halloween, talking about the film, this distance.
So then Loomis becomes like the most kind of shrill and obnoxious parts of Halloween, right?
Absolutely.
I actually just rewatched the movie last night, and it had never occurred to me before, but basically from the first moment he's on screen, he's shouting about evil, and it makes me wonder why we ever take him seriously, as a professional or as anything else. He's this shrill kind of hysterical, hand-wringing figure from the very first moments.
It is strange. I wanted to go back to something you had mentioned about this kind of space behind the mask, this empty space that we can kind of slip into. I think by having that kind of empty subjective place, it kind of inadvertently does something where we're in this empty space behind the mask that's devoid of psychology, and it's so cold, and it's so kind of just clinical, like we've said, that when we find out through Loomis that Michael Myers is he's just evil, well, then what do we relate this evil to? Is the experience of being behind the mask, and what's behind the mask is just nothingness. It's just pure seeing. Is like no emotion. And I think that that's just a problematic place for me. Like, I could go two ways with it. Where is this a really clever way of depicting him as purely a psychopath that doesn't feel emotions than anyone else, and then Loomis is categorizing this as evil? Or is the implication that evil is just it's so real, and it's so real that it just is, and it's so real in the sense that it can't even be experienced by that which is not evil. Like, I find it very problematic when I try to reconcile Michael Myers is evil, but this empty place behind the mask, that has always kind of gnawed at me.
I think that I like kind of Letitia's kind of run at this more than any kind of I don't know, allegory for psychotic behavior or something. I think that it is that there's nothing naturalistic or realistic about the film. I think it's a it really is attempting to make a piece of art out of a horror film. And Letitia, you brought up the Rob Zombie remake, which I think attempts to do a lot more what Chris is talking about here, which is to really kind of, I don't know, dramatize that way of thinking, or that, I don't know if you refer to it as a way of thinking, but that kind of psychosis. And I think that there's definitely something else going on here. I think I actually really like Letitia's idea of seeing Michael as, the director. He's kind of guiding the audience through these scenes, and that just problematic is a good word for it, and I keep wanting to resist every attempt to psychoanalyze the film.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking I think this movie is about serial killers or evil the same way that Suspiria is about witches. Like, it's not about any of those things, actually, but they're a way to create something aesthetic. I just feel like it's highly aesthetic. And for some reason, even though in my personal, I get really worked up about things like trauma and the relationship to crime and evil, and in my real life I do, but in this film, I was thinking, I think you wrote something about this, Chris, in your email about your problem with this, and I was wondering, why don't I have a problem with this? But there's something about the film that so completely seems divorced from actual any real problems of evil or not, that it's hard for me to frame it that way.
Yeah, I think that it is. It's so beautiful, and detached looking. I think there are always implications with the shots you choose, and I think and this is something that I feel I'm starting to discover in a lot of his films, is that I enjoy them so. Choices in the films, they're hard to reconcile with themselves, and this is something I wanted to talk about. Was I think I find Carpenter in one sense like invites a lot of investigation, because his films are so clearly they're so clearly the work of this single-minded artist, but at the same time his world is so complete and kind of unified in his technique and vision that it becomes nearly it's difficult to penetrate, I feel like, because it does feel so whole. But anyway, when I do start to dismantle it and look at things like the function of a POV in his films, I do have to bring some amount of something from other films of what I know about. This is someone specific seeing this, and what does that tell me? And then I guess the other thing I was getting at was this like kind of proclivity for wide shots that were maybe some of the enjoyment comes from this looking that we're talking about, and this aesthetic experience which happens from the wide shots, because in these long shots and wide shots, I think there's a wholeness in them, and there's this idea of like knowability, and like that we can like kind of be omniscient, which I think there's a lot in his films, how much the camera can move, what the camera can penetrate, how much it can see, how effortlessly it moves. And I think maybe there is a pleasure in this being able to see so much so smoothly, so gracefully. I don't even know where I started. I've been rambling. I apologize.
No, that's great. Go ahead.
I also, those long shots are obviously, a hallmark. And I almost, in many of them, it feels like there's like almost something overtly, an overt statement being made in those. We'll get there, but in Prince of Darkness, there's a scene early on where Donald Pleasant's character gets out of a car in front of the church, and we've got really one of our principles in this film, almost like microscopic on. This is like the establishing shot where we should have, it's almost like a parody of that shot in The Exorcist where the exorcist is, standing outside the building looking up, where here's the man of God come to face this thing. And he's like an insect, that, and I think that there's a lot of that in Carpenter, that people get swallowed up in their landscapes, in the Thing, that's huge, that giant expansive landscape. But it looks the same, whether it's a suburban street in Illinois or whether it's a church in the city. It's all just little tiny people moving through their world.
So it seems like there's a relationship. To me, the idea is you can see a lot. You can see, but you can't really know. Like, to me, the knowability versus ability to see is big because of that lack of access to other people's heads. To me, that's a big theme. But maybe at this point, unless you have more to say about Halloween, we might move into The Thing, because I think a lot of the things we're talking about we can transition. But if anyone else has any last thing before we move on.
I guess the last thing I would say is, like, I do agree that, like, this ability to see and the way that we can see and kind of the effortlessness of seeing and the expansiveness of our seeing is where a lot of the pleasure and as we know is where a lot of people think the pleasure of films comes from is the freedom and the power in seeing. And it's like a kind of, it's a very pleasurable act, but I think Carpenter starts to really trouble that line because, like you said, the impenetrability of other people, the kind of the inevitable kind of like problems of human organization and things like that. So any kind of knowing is undercut and kind of a problem in his films, but seeing is not a problem at all, and very, very pleasant and beautiful. And I think this is kind of, even at Halloween, I think it's even as early as Assault on Precinct 13, we see this kind of cold, distant Carpenter that we get. It feels safe. It feels good to be far away from things. And I think that speaks to us. I think that speaks to a kind of pleasure that we get in the power of our seeing, but also in the safety we get from these kind of distances. Not just in the distance, the safety of the distance, but also in the expansiveness of that view. I mean, anyway, that's what I was trying to say.
Fabulous. I think that's going to come into play with The Thing. So who did The Thing? Is it Josh, right?
That was my pick, yeah.
All right, awesome. I think we all watched it, but so do you want to give a summary, even though that's probably not necessary?
So yeah, The Thing is 1982, so we're a few years after Halloween, with Kurt Russell and a very impressive beard.
Yeah.
And the beards definitely beat out the mustaches in Carpenter, I think. We can all,
yeah. They should.
Yeah, I think they go head to head, but no, it's a remake of the John Hawkes film, which makes a cameo in Halloween, I noticed also. And some geologists, is that what's happening there? In the Arctic, there's some sort of alien thing that's been dug up from the ice, and it starts taking people over. It's a thing. And pretty quickly, it's some sort of shape-shifting life form, and so you don't know who's the real them and who is actually the them that wants to eat your brains. And paranoia and lots of flamethrowers and the best John Carpenter movie, period, as far as I'm concerned. But we'll get to that, I suppose.
Which is, I think it's very interesting because I hadn't seen this film in a while, and it's just, I mean, the word that I always think of when I think of The Thing is just impressive. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like this is Carpenter kind of asserting himself as being on the level of any good mainstream director that was working at that time and making a really slick, excellent film that holds up really well. But strangely, it it doesn't fit in as well for me with other Carpenter films. And I think it's because there is these wide shots that we talk about, these long shots. Simply the space that this film exists in denies a lot of that. I feel like, and watching it again, I was like, wow, so many of the things I really love about Carpenter aren't happening in this film. I still love this film, and I think it's definitely one of his best, directorial like pieces. But I do think it is a bit different aesthetically. I feel like there's a difference with this film.
It's a lot closer. It's a lot more claustrophobic.
Yeah, and even then. Oh, God, I'm sorry.
I was going to say that there's a certain sense that it does take some of those same ideas, and then that distance, the unknowability, the discomfort with other people's existence, and turns it into like a closed room mystery, like where we don't get that distance is denied, and all of a sudden, it blows up fast. So
yeah, you get an intensity in this from because usually when that distance is a literal distance, such a pleasant experience. It's just this kind of like, you're comfortable with this kind of space between you and whatever this weirdness of reality or whatever thing we're talking about is. But yeah, when you get all these people close together and it's not the space, the distance isn't literal. It's just the gulf between these people and their ability to trust. You get probably some of the most intense scenes in any Carpenter movie. You get some really good acting, some really tense moments. I was really, really impressed.
This movie, I have the most emotional response to it. Like, it's the one, like, unlike Halloween, which I don't think I had a single sort of emotional response to, this one just really gets me. It seems really deeply sad to me. I just feel really, it's just I think it just plays on my whole trust issues, which I think Carpenter shares, that you can't know other people. And even if people appear to be friendly, you don't really know if they are really. Like, that there's nothing you can know about a person really. And I think that's like a deep central problem that runs throughout all the movies. It is unknowability, but also this need to be near people, because at the end of the thing, I just love that ending where I think the character's name is Childs. I love that actor too, and I can't remember his name. They're together, and Kurt Russell doesn't know how he's made it to the end, right? And I didn't get to watch the end again. I watched half of it. So I think I'm remembering this right. So they sit down together, and they have to. Like, at that point, there's nothing else to do. You can't, because they need each other at that point, Who cares if he's a thing now? Because there's nothing else left but to be with a person.
Yeah.
Which almost makes it sound positive, but it doesn't. It sure doesn't feel that way.
No, it's not positive. It's like, well, I guess we're stuck here together, even though you might start, throwing tentacles in me, and it's just, yeah.
I think it's actually, I don't think it's positive at all, because I think at the end, it's just the nature of the game is so clear at the end, because they haven't decided, they're not going to find any sort of comfort in each other's company until death takes them. They're waiting, they're waiting for the inevitable, because now it's just so clear. And it is a really kind of bleak, cynical ending. And I think the thing, I don't know if anybody else agrees with this, but I think the paranoia in Carpenter, or no, the radical skepticism in Carpenter, I think rears its head for the first time really intensely in The Thing. And we see like this skepticism just kind of continue, like, I don't know if I want to call it skepticism or paranoia, like, but it kind of continues, throughout his films. I mean, we definitely see it in They Live, and that's paranoia as well, and Prince of Darkness, and I think that, you see that pretty clearly in the end of The Thing. I feel it's a pretty bleak movie.
Yeah.
It's like it's a Sartrean ending, This,
yeah.
This, I was just thinking that from somewhere around the same time period, we'd have like the Hollywood version of this in like an enemy mine or something like that.
Oh God.
We'd have these two, seeming enemies who would, find this meeting of the minds as they're thrust into this, terrible situation, and they would bond over it, and yeah, there's absolutely none of that to be right here. It's just. Yeah, just like you said, Chris, they're waiting to die.
Yeah, or they're waiting to see who the other one to be killed. Because they know, and I think that's even worse. That they're not going to even die together, like because of nature, something outside the both of them. One will kill the other. And I guess the worst way I think you can read The Thing is to look at the title and say, what is the thing? Is the thing just the other, people? Or if you put a bunch of people in a room, a small enough space together, there's just going to be something that makes them turn on each other, and it's like, I don't know. I mean, this there quite literally is the thing, and I'm taking a huge liberty, but I think it's like, if you wanted to read it even more kind of cynically, there is that.
Yeah, well, I think like that goes with the whole, like Carpenter loves the Westerns, right? Who's the director, Hawks? Like the cowboy character, like Kurt Russell is the individual who was gonna win towards the end. And so these people at some point just become things to kill to get to like the end, but there's no end point that makes any sense. So it's like this cowboy movie where there's nowhere really to go and no thing to really achieve. So
yeah, I think it's interesting that this very clearly shows something that, I think you see Carpenter films that don't operate like this, but there is a few that do operate in this way where, this isn't necessarily friendship completely for the most part. It's people willing to cooperate. Up until a certain point. Individuals willing to enter into an agreement. I think that's a lot of times Carpenter's view of society, like, the struggle to really maintain individualism, but we have to enter into like kind of agreements or like relationships with people to accomplish other things. But you do see real friendship in his films, but I think overwhelmingly more you see these kind of relationships,
That's a great point with The Thing. They aren't friends in the beginning. The biggest friendship is between that guy and the dog in the beginning, right? He has the most, they have the most connections. Yeah, that's interesting.
I think there are friendships in The Thing, but I think our protagonist, the person we're supposed to be following, has a lot of problems with that. Because you see the guy and the dog, you see what's his name, where he says, "I've known him for 10 years. He's my friend, for God's sake."
Yeah.
Kurt Russell, I think he respects like Wilford Brimley's character, but as not someone that seems like he's willing to enter into a deep friendship,
Well, and this also, kind of signals the beginning of kind of an allegorical level of Carpenter that we'll see, kind of played out more cartoonishly in They Live and stuff. But Letitia's description of a cowboy movie with nowhere to go and no sane end sight, that's like Reagan's America right there. That is 1980s Cold War, that I do think that there's a pretty blatant kind of political allegory to be had here, and it doesn't look too positive from the way it's all going to play out. But.
I think that's where, when I talk about sometimes rather than paranoia, I just like to say skepticism in Carpenter, because it's like we started The Thing and just like this, having to be radically skeptical about if someone is still human, and I think actually, to jump ahead, to Prince of Darkness, I don't think you can have a more skeptical, like, kind of, there's a really skeptical element in that film, just totally skeptical of reality. And I think that's you see the end and They Live, of course, and I think that's really And in one sense, I thought that was interesting that he's trying to get at such a pure horror in these films that like the nature of your reality is something that cannot be trusted and is not really knowable, and you don't have a leg to stand on. And that's I always thought it was interesting to get such a pure kind of horror, but at the same time, it's like maybe like the most depressing thing like I could think of, you know.
So if we have anything else to say about The Thing, we can. But we can also maybe transition on the sort of political Reagan note. But anything else before we move on?
Just great performances. I mean, like to just kind of on a less critical level. Like I mean, just Keith David is just amazing. I love him
David.
too.
Yeah, Keith David.
I mean, he's never not good. I mean, and Kurt Russell, amazing.
There's one response that I have to, and you've already said it, I think we've all said it, but I do respond to the end of this film. And I was just talking to my wife today and talking about, we watched like 7 or 8 Carpenter movies over the last few weeks, kind of.
Wow.
And I was kind of recognizing this is kind of my reader's response, kind of criticism of Carpenter. But I tend to, in the kind of in the denouement, in the last act, I tend to kind of fade out on a lot of his films, like that, and I think it has something to do with that emotional distance and the fact that maybe I don't really care about most of the characters in a lot of Carpenter movies, but they tend to start better than they end. You know that there's so much scene setting and building atmosphere, and that I really feel like I'm being drawn in, and then when the story actually has to resolve, I'm, Well. But this movie I don't think works that way at all. I think this it really does kind of just propel you right along to that ending, which is kind of like the perfect beat at the end of it.
Yeah, I think it's the most kind of like as a work in its like, in its totality, it does have the best, it might have the best beat of his films. I also think that part of what makes some of me check out a little bit in Carpenter is that it feels like at a certain point things are hopeless, and reality is never completely repaired in Carpenter, because part of most of the horror, the conflict is revealing that what you thought was true is not true, or something exists that you didn't know existed, and it's far more terrible than you thought it was, and the truth is really horrible. And I think that that realization, while very frightening, or horrifying in his films, like it's hard to care after a certain point, in his films. Like in They Live, when it's revealed that the nature of reality and that aliens, that half the population are aliens controlling you, and it's just this kind of like overwhelming, kind of like control that exists. I never truly believe in that film that they can win. In Prince of Darkness, I don't believe they can win. And I think also in The Thing, actually in The Thing, I do believe they can win. Yeah, that's the one where I'm like, they could kill this thing, because there's only one thing, but anyway, I think that's why I check out to a degree. It's a kind of despairing kind of world that he creates.
Well, this is a good note to move to They Live. But Josh, did you have something real quick?
No, good.
Okay, cool. Well, speaking of despairing and seeing reality and whatnot, They Live was my choice. I hadn't seen this since I was a kid, like 8, so I was really excited to rewatch it. And so this is about a sort of out of work, down on his luck guy named Nada. That's his last name, but his name is never mentioned in the film, I don't think. Played by Rowdy Roddy Piper, who I think we all remember from wrestling in the 80s, along with The Undertaker and Hulk Hogan and all the others who I enjoyed.
Just to clarify, The Undertaker is not in this film.
No, he's not in this film. That would be better.
Want to clarify that. Yeah. Just to check. The Iron Sheik, though.
Yeah, so anyway, he's kind of milling around this shanty town looking for work, and comes across this church where they're making glasses. And there's this this whole sort of conspiracy theory around this that there's this televised. It's kind of hard to explain this now that I'm trying, but there's this televised message that things aren't what they seem. They're controlling us, and no one knows what this is about. And so he puts on these glasses and sees suddenly that all the advertisements have coded messages, and that people are not, half the people are aliens, and it's kind of upper class people, and that the world just isn't what we think it is, basically. So in watching this movie again as an adult, I was really kind of conflicted. I didn't know if it was intentionally funny. Like, to me, this is the most goofy Carpenter movie of all the movies. Like, I know certain points are supposed to be funny. For example, there's like a 15-minute ridiculous fist fight in an alleyway between, is it Keith David, is that the actor's name, and Mr. Piper. And it's just ridiculous, but it's fantastic. And, there's the kick-ass and chew bubblegum scene, but then there's also these juxtaposition with these sort of realistic scenes, much more than I'm used to in Carpenter, of like the shanty town and the looking for work, and it just seemed that there was this kind of weird sympathy that I hadn't felt in his films before. I guess the sympathy from a camera point of view, and I don't know exactly how to explain that. I don't know, film terms.
You're not referring to the work of Mr. Piper? Is that what you're saying? he didn't make you feel deeply.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I think his performance is pretty good in this movie. I do. I think he has a great monologue. I think I think he walks a really interesting line in this movie and does a lot of things. There's some humor, but there's some real pathos in his performance, and it's unexpected. And I think that there is this kind of, a lot of the reason I think there is this goofiness in this film is I think a lot of this is a reaction to how I think Carpenter felt he was being, filmmakers of his ilk were kind of being looked at. There's a very explicit Romero reference at the end of the film in one of the newscasts. And I think that, he's really, he doesn't want to play the game anymore by the time he's making this film. And this film is playing, with violence and playing with these ridiculous genre ideas. But then it's also, got something pretty serious on its mind, pretty contemporary. About Reagan-era America and the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, showing things that no other film was showing. These shanty towns, this level of like unemployment, and these people, jobs going overseas and whatnot. And I think that he's doing a lot in this film. And I think what divides people is, does it add up? It's a personal thing, maybe. I don't know. Does it add up for you, or does it not add up for you? And I think for me, it's pretty successful.
That's interesting. I want to say I agree about the Roddy Piper thing. I think he's actually quite effective, and especially there's that weird little scene where he's talking about his childhood and his dad. Tanner made me think of the end of First Blood.
Oh yeah.
That great monologue about now what else was I saying? But yeah, it's the incoherency of the movie that I don't really understand. Maybe I'm just uncomfortable with ambiguity, but I just leave the movie thinking, what was this hero I can't really get behind, because he doesn't seem to have a single thought the entire movie. And the bad guys are aliens who are making us act in a way. And so the critique, I can't really figure out maybe I'm looking for a one-to-one correspondence that is maybe too simple, but I just have a lot of trouble with this movie.
No, it's kind of this kind of shotgun approach to parody. I think that it's just kind of throwing a really wide net, and sometimes I think seems to be just parodying almost itself. The types of films, and then this kind of cartoonish political critique. And yeah, I agree with you. It's hard to find a center to it, it's very strange all the way through. The tone is, and like you said, I think Letitia, you brought this up, that how disturbing it is. When as soon as the facts are uncovered, the first thing that he does is to go on this like rampage, to like walk in and just start blowing people away. It's like almost like I think that there is this kind of wish for every conspiracy theorist, that there is a plot, so it'll give us something to, lash out at. We need an enemy.
Yeah, I think that's definitely present. I think there's this. I mean, on two levels. I think there is this kind of antagonism that Carpenter is playing with such hyper violence directed toward a very specific group of people. But at the same time, I don't know where the satire begins and ends with this, because something I was thinking about this time around with it is, I mean, it is a fantasy. It is something that, like you're saying with conspiracy theorists, I think the desire with a lot of that is, why can't things just be simpler? Why can't we know who the enemy is? Why can't it be simple enough to put on a pair of glasses and see who can't be trusted, or see, who's the enemy? And I think that is a really borderline dangerous part of this film. I guess I don't understand maybe where the parody begins or ends with this, because I know the film's been read a lot of ways, and I don't know. I do think that it's pretty problematic.
Yeah, and I mean, just going back to kind of our beginning conversation with Halloween in terms of seeing and knowability and the idea that there is, some particular method of looking that, reveals the truth or something. And we even have a blind priest wandering through this movie, that it starts to feel almost like a parody of kind of Carpenter's own methodology or something, this emphasis on looking.
Yeah, I think maybe it's like yeah, absolutely. I mean, Halloween starts in one place, and then you get several films that are highly skeptical of the nature of seeing and the way that we see. I mean, like The Thing, engages with this in not knowing, who is who, and then They Live. I mean, the nature of the society we live in. It feels like it goes further and further. With The Thing, the skepticism starts with on a person-to-person basis. In They Live, it's a societal basis. And I think when we end in Prince of Darkness, it's on a subatomic level that we can't even trust the nature of our reality. And the skepticism grows and grows. And I think They Live is in a very weird, problematic middle zone, and I guess one thing I do like about the film, and I don't know if Zizek talks about this in the article that read or was circulating, or if he alludes to this, I do like the fight scene in the film, because I do feel like it has a point, and that point is that sometimes it's not easy to put the glasses on and see things the way that they are, and I think we see this kind of moment in a few Carpenter movies where people resist seeing, I don't know, the world as it is, quote unquote.
Is it Zizek? Is that how you say his name?
Yeah.
He does mention that. He mentions particularly race when he talks about that scene. That for the black man, it's even more difficult to want to put on the glasses to make life even more difficult to see clearly. Is what he says. And he also says this is one of the two great leftist films of the last 30 years. The other one is Fight Club. So I don't know how I don't even know ideologically how to place this movie. It seems so confused to me, but I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, on reading it again, I do think that it is pretty problematic to look at this as a leftist movie. I think it's a highly paranoid film. If it is genuine, it's very paranoid, and it's very it's a fantasy. It's a fantasy of simplicity, and if it's a parody of those things, then I don't know, what is it really reaffirming then? How far left is it then if it's a parody? I don't know. Yeah, that reading is a little problematic to me.
I just took the 10-minute fight scene to be an example of homosexual panic, but
that's a great line from Prince of Darkness.
we've already talked about the way, the kind of coldness between characters in here, but it's genuinely weird in this film the way those two characters kind of hook up with each other in this film. It's Roddy Piper has his like contractual shirtless scene 4 minutes in, and it really it's there's these gazes across the yard, and these offers to and yeah, there definitely felt like there was something going on there between these two that and maybe I'm just reading too much into this performance, but I don't know, that there was definitely a pretty strong homoerotic undertone to the whole thing.
I think maybe they're able to engage in a kind of forced intimacy in this movie because they're on the run. When you put glasses on and see pretty much most everybody in the world is an alien, that cannot be trusted. They're forced into a pretty tight relationship that I think is really interesting, and maybe that's the only way in Carpenter you can get to maybe this intimate place is to not have any other choice, I think that's interesting. I think also, you see that in, I guess, I don't know, in The Thing, it ends a very different place than that of just like, well, no, because one of them isn't human, so I guess it doesn't really count.
Well, I mean, there's definitely the beginnings of some interesting questions about gender in here, and that, the character who should be the love interest is this completely cold woman who he like kidnaps and takes home, and very awkward scene there before she kicks him out a window, right? And and of course she turns out to be completely untrustworthy.
I think she's untrustworthy, but she's very smart, and I think actually something in Carpenter that I like is along the terms of gender is that most of the men are pretty dumb. and I think that, like, yeah, if we in Halloween, I think Jamie Lee Curtis is resourceful. She's smart. She's a interesting character. Donald Pleasance is a raving maniac. In The Thing, it's nothing but men together, and they just want to kill each other. They just want to fight. I think there's a lot of being a man is a handicap in a John Carpenter movie to a degree. I mean, look at Kurt Russell in Big Trouble in Little China. It's just probably he's such a fool. I like that about his films. Well,
interestingly enough, the 2010 remake of The Thing casts a woman as the protagonist.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Say that. It's very interesting. I like her too. I like that.
Mm-hmm. So nobody's got skeleton key here for They Live, huh?
Well, one thing to talk about character, I think, is we've talked about there's not super likable characters in Carpenter. I think there are. I like the characters. I don't think you can get very close to them, but I think there's when he does it right, he's able to sketch them very quickly with a few elements, and really a master of kind of like character or like implied character, I think, with what he does. When it doesn't work, it comes off pretty two-dimensional, I think. And I think that's a criticism some people have of Prince of Darkness.
Mm. Well, as a segue, do you guys want to move on to Prince of Darkness or anything else about They Live?
Let's.
All right. So, Chris, you had Prince of Darkness?
Yeah, Prince of Darkness essentially is about an old priest dies who has a scroll that he's been protecting this container that holds a liquid in the basement of a church that essentially is just pure evil. Literally pure evil. A substance which is evil. And the Catholic Church has been a huge conspiracy. It's been lying to the world for years. Everything is wrong. The nature of the universe is wrong. Evil is real. In a sense, everything's true and everything's not true. And it's coming back. And guess who's leading it? Alice Cooper. Yeah, I mean, it's just the ultimate attempt at pure horror, which is like tying, I guess, like theoretical physics to like a pure idea of like evil and literally Satan. I think it's a very ambitious, interesting attempt, and I thought it was worth rewatching. I actually really like this film, and I think this is a very pure expression of Carpenter. I think it's almost so pure and such a pure expression of what he does. It's to a fault. And I think this is the ultimate in what he can do, and how taken too far, it becomes not successful.
What do you mean? What do you think is not successful about that taken too far? Sorry, and Josh, if you have something too, but I'm just curious to me.
Well, I guess actually I'm kind of jumping on a bandwagon here because I actually love this film, but I think it doesn't work for certain people, and I think it's because of the characters. Some people feel like you can't get close to them. They feel like they're not defined enough. This kind of distance that you see in this film. There's a lot of distance. There's a lot of wide in this film. This radical skepticism just about the nature of reality. I mean, this is taking it, I think, to the furthest he ever takes it, which is literally at the beginning of the film, they say, you know, our reality breaks down on a subatomic level to shadows, and telling you that, you know, they talk about with Schrodinger's cat or whatever that is, like, you know, all these things that he's alluding to that are just saying, you know, what you know, the way you see the world, how you know is wrong. And I think this, radical skepticism, distance, these kind of like caricatures of people don't work for some people. I love this film. I think it's great, but I'm more of saying, you know, to a fault, maybe in that sense, it's a little alienating.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can understand all of that. I find the film to actually just be pretty damn fun. I mean, it just very strange tonal shifts throughout. You know, just like I say, for the first 45 minutes of this movie, I'm not really sure what kind of movie I'm supposed to be watching.
Yeah.
Like there's, you know, like there's a relationship forming between that guy with the mustache and
Simon.
What's that?
He's the other Simon in the TV show Simon and Simon.
Right. And it feels like that's, you know, supposed to be the core of this movie, and then that, you know, it's just kind of thrust aside. And you know, there's this. It starts out with a whole lot of talk about physics, which also kind of gets subsumed by all this kind of religious mumbo jumbo. And that, you know, it's just constantly shifting throughout, so it keeps you on your toes, most definitely. This is definitely one of those movies where I felt like I started to just fade 3/4 of the way through, like it was just, and again, I can't really say why. I do want to throw out there though that one of the things that grabbed me about this is that, you know, there's a lot of exposition in this movie, you know, in a way that most Carpenter movies don't. You know, there's just a lot of characters standing around explaining stuff. And that about midway through is basically this kind of idea that free will itself is, you know, an illusion. And rewatching Halloween, one of the earliest scenes in that, as Laurie Strode is sitting in her high school classroom, is this discussion about, you know, the embodiment of fate. And I was wondering just how Greek these films really are. You know, if we can just kind of go back, you know, we've raised the question about what horror is before, and Chris, you were raising this again in some of our emails, you know, if we can get toward a definition. If, you know, like those original Greek tragedies, which I would argue are definitely an example of horror, isn't that where the horror comes from? Is the inability of the individual to actually have free agency. You know, that no matter what choices you make, you're going to be the victim of fate one way or the other. And, you know, is that part of what's playing out through a lot of these movies? So that was a huge idea that I'll just throw out there.
I could think I see that definitely in Prince of Darkness, was something we talked about, like this unending horror, or in a sense unending evil, and I think that kind of can be associated with that idea of fate. Fate is this line that is not an unbroken line, and like say in Prince of Darkness, I think we talked about this. The horror will always exist on the other side of the mirror. It's always there, and it's inescapable, and it can't be there's no, it is that constant line, or that constant parallel line. I would see that. How do you think that's at play in Halloween? Do you think that's alluded to in the classroom? But do you think it plays into Michael Myers and the whole conflict?
That's what I've been kind of trying to make sense of. Is it seems pretty heavy-handed to have that out there at the beginning of the film, and then have our walking embodiment of something. Which goes back to another conversation we were having, which is the way that these killers operate in these slasher films, which is really this very kind of hand of judgment kind of kind of Old Testament kind of Yahweh figure that just kind of wanders through, striking you down for whatever perceived guilt. Much has been made, obviously, of the way teenagers are always being punished for everything throughout these movies.
Yeah.
So, I mean, fate, God, you can start playing word association games here, but, evil, I don't know.
That's kind of Lovecrafty, right? This idea that there's this ultimate horror. Well, he has a word for this, right? Because at the end of every Lovecraft story, the person goes crazy because they glimpse this thing, and then the story's over, right? That's basically so it's like this idea that there's this unending, horror that it's always there.
Yeah, and I think that Prince of Darkness gets at that in a very explicit way, with like this other dimension or this other place that we can't see, that's always there. And I think that is, I think Prince of Darkness takes it to a crisis level that's like hard for Carpenter to recover from. Like I think Prince of Darkness is really fun. I think the characterizations are super fun. I think Dennis Dunn is like one of the great characters in a film ever. I think he's excellent. But I think it's really heavy. I think it's getting at something really bleak, like in a way, and it leaves me in a really weird place. The end of this movie, and I like it. It's one of my favorite Carpenters, but it confuses me a bit.
Yeah, I didn't know how I felt about this movie when I saw it. I thought the first 20 minutes and the last 15, 20 minutes were extremely effective. Something about that beginning where you get like these little quick shots and the music, Carpenter's great synthesizer thing, and it sort of built this tension. I was like, oh shit, what's gonna happen? And the ending has this sort of crazy blowout of insanity, but in the middle I got, because I think someone mentioned this, the tone and for me, I did have a problem with the characters. I didn't quite have a sense of who anybody was or why. Like the main relationship, I didn't understand what was attracting them, and I guess that's beyond the point. I don't know, but so I had a hard time. But it was a depressing ending for me, and I didn't quite know what to do with it. So yeah, I share the sort of weird feeling.
Isn't that kind of a running gag in this movie? There's people keep wandering off and being kind of chewed up by this evil force, and there's like that gag is repeated like 3 times. It's like, have you seen what's her name? Well, who's she? She's that one, and it's like nobody knows who anybody is.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And I mean, I found this movie really funny in places too. So like the goofiness, some of the killings were goofy, and Alice Cooper just showing up as goofy for me anyway. Like, so I don't have much to say about that.
I think that's something I do agree that this film tries to do, and that's really unique, is that it does put a bunch of people that don't really know each other that well, that are just kind of like ships passing in the night constantly throughout this film in this space, walking around. And yeah, it is a running gag, but I think it is, there is this kind of, there's a resonance in that I think maybe, I could see you extrapolating from that, like something he's trying to say, about these relationships and these people, and I don't know. Yeah, I like that about this, and I think that the humor has always been really. You brought up humor in Carpenter, Letitia, and I think that there's a lot of it in Prince of Darkness. But it's always been a weird thing for me to try to like reconcile in like such a heavy subject matter.
Yeah.
And, like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. That was my main trouble. Like, sometimes I get confused. Like, is this supposed to be funny? Is it funny accidentally? And if so, does that make this movie less good because it's accidentally funny? But then I think there's really purposeful. But then I think, well, is an accidental humor a bad thing? I don't know.
I just wanted to go back to what you were saying, Letitia. You brought up Lovecraft, and I think that points to something that Chris was talking about with the. It might help explain some of what Chris was getting at about the direction of these movies, and is that in Lovecraft there's it's all build up, and then there's this moment or something. There's this the doors of perception are cleansed for a moment. We see what's on the other side. We lose our shit, and the story's over. And a lot of these stories, that's the beginning. That rather than that being the climax of the story, that's the setup. And I think that Chris, you kind of got at this. That's hard to maintain.
Yeah.
Like once that's your starting place, where do you go is just a really hard thing to maintain for several of these movies, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of these take place after the fact with these revelations, and there is this. Yeah, I think there's this kind of somber tone that is like this latently present, in some of these films. I mean, and I think it's a tonal thing that he creates with score, with the way they're shot, and definitely narratively, like where kind of like they're starting after this revelation. I mean, and it's funny that, maybe we didn't talk about, In the Mouth of Madness. I mean, obviously he's aware of Lovecraft, and drawing on those ideas. Yeah.
The Fog, I mean, is quite an outlier, isn't it? I mean, it really does kind of take that Lovecraftian structure, and that movie works much more in that way. This kind of steady building up of dread toward, before the fog finally does hit,
Yeah.
Before the things start coming out. I want to throw it out there too, because like I said, I've been watching a ton of these. Is it another outlier in terms of character to me would be Christine, which I watched for the first time in preparation for the show. And I feel like that is probably the most character-driven Carpenter film that I've ever seen.
Absolutely. It's a little startling when you first see that, especially because that's actually the last of his films that I saw only a couple of years ago. And now it's one of my favorites, actually. But it's so character-driven. It shows us, a whole different world than I feel like we ever really see. I mean, it's like really dialogue-driven, really character-driven. Yeah, I think that's a really odd one, but a really, really strong one.
That's a Stephen King adaptation, and I think that has a lot to do with the character. And I mean, that's just basically how he goes about. That's my favorite too, though. I love Christine. We should do another Carpenter episode and fill in these gaps.
I mean, maybe we're just gonna get deeper and deeper into the. Yeah, I mean, I feel like again, maybe it goes back to kind of something I was saying earlier, that Carpenter, seems to invite so much investigation, but once you start to question what he does, it's like a very self-referential, self-reflexive kind of world that he creates. You know what I mean? It's a very internally functioning place, that like Carpenter's world is Carpenter's world, and a lot of things make sense there, but getting in there, it gets very complicated. For me, at least, I thought, it's funny because I feel like I understood these films to a degree, but and I enjoy them so much, but yeah, it is a very aesthetic experience for me, and once I try to, it's going back, I said this at the beginning, going and kind of like looking at what these films are actually doing is very different than the pleasure I feel like I am getting from them, and that's really interesting to me.
Well, and that to me is a description of the aesthetic experience of horror. I mean,
yeah,
the idea of taking some sort of aesthetic enjoyment from watching people being, hacked up or, whatever is, that should always be problematic. And I think you're right, though, that Carpenter kind of pushes that on us. He kind of, he's kind of rubbing our nose in it a little bit.
I don't watch those scenes actually, so I just read the articles.
Well, we might want to wrap it up pretty soon. Any last things about Carpenter that we need to know?
I mean, I think this recurring, one thing we referenced, but I think it's just a good last image to stay with is you sent some screenshots of, images from Carpenter movies out, Josh, and I think that long shot of something in the distance is really powerful, and something that I think that he is just has mastered. I mean, I think there's a reason why he came to prominence so much in the 80s, in the time of Stephen King. There's definitely this kind of momentum that they're both creating with this dread and getting back to a really pure idea of horror. And I think that what Stephen King is able to do with words, Carpenter largely, when he's really successful, is able to do with images and these ideas of dread and this thing that's off in the distance, and also a very Lovecraftian idea. But he truly is excellent when it comes to that.
Amen.
Hallelujah, and I think we're done. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and happy Halloween.
Yay, happy